Welcome to the Two Gurus Top Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant-Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering lessons learned in the $3 billion TD Bank money laundering settlement, whether the compliance community should stop obsessing over the new DOJ compliance program evaluation guidance, how to manage employees during an election cycle, and Florida man's request that the cops check to see if his drugs are bad. But first, Tom, how has your week been and what do you think is the most interesting development?
I've certainly had better weeks. The most interesting development of the week has been fall weathers in Texas. It's 75 today.
All
So that's
right.
very pleasant. So about right on time for us, October 16th as we're recording this.
All righty. You know what? I think it was unusual that we both picked exactly the same story about exactly the same thing. So we're going to take a couple of different takes on this. Why don't you start out telling us about this really extraordinary TD Bank settlement?
Absolutely. I am in the middle of a multi-part blog post on this. And every day, Christy, when I reread the information, the criminal information, and then the settlement requirements, I'm just either more amazed, more aghast, or other. This is just unbelievable. For nearly 10 years, literally up until April 2024, TD Bank America, that's the subsidiary of the Canadian bank, TD Bank, engaged in the most massive money laundering extravaganza that we've seen in a long time. And it wasn't because they had the wrong systems in place, is because they had systems in place that were completely ineffective and they starved them with money for the last 6 years due to something called a flat cost paradigm where they put zero money into their compliance program. And this was with the knowledge and support of the two heads of AML in the American Bank. They failed to um, review over $18.3 trillion in transactions over that time. The amount of money laundering that went through the bank is somewhere between 500 million and a billion. There were three major schemes or scams even that criminals used. This was not a situation where no one knew. The bank tellers knew. That's how bad it was. When someone would come in and say, I'm going to give you $1 million in cash here and I want to take a few checks, bank checks back with me. Even the bank tellers knew this wasn't right. The bank internal audit was not in on this. They did their job. They reported that the systems were inefficient. External third party consultants, Tom and Christie, if hired,
I
told
didn't
them
tell them this. I was not part of this. Go ahead, Tom.
told them that their systems were insufficient and they weren't filing the appropriate suspicious activity reports. So everybody knew and they made the conscious decision. I'm thinking about entitling my blog post tomorrow, What Happens When You Drive 90 and No Brakes. That's what happened here. And of course, the bank says, how are we to know? If you drive 90 and you don't have brakes and you don't maintain your brakes, eventually you're going to hit somebody. And that's what happened here. And this is just unbelievable. The fine and penalty is obviously huge at 3 billion. That's the bank did not self-disclose. They did, however, cooperate with the Department of Justice once the banking regulators approached them. They did facilitate holdbacks and clawbacks. So they got credit for that. But you have to ask, is this penalty sufficient? I mean, I don't want to say how long you and I have been doing this kind of work, but isn't it time somebody got the message? Uh, I don't know. So I was going to talk about the punishment here because frankly, I find it completely insufficient. $3 billion dollars and then an override of a growth restriction of 7%, which can be clamped down 7% per year if the bank does not meet its compliance requirements. And I don't see how they can. They're so far behind the eight ball. The 2018 TD America AML program was better than the 2024 program. That's how much they had starved it. So the question is, what is an appropriate penalty? Why on earth aren't bank executives, the senior directors involved in AML, why aren't they being called to task? TD Bank America is a U.S. publicly traded company, which means the Securities and Exchange Commission have jurisdiction over this. They are in New York, so the Department of Financial Services probably has something over this. But here's the one that I thought of today when I was trying to think about how to talk about punishments, Kristy. What about Caremark?
Mhm.
And what about Caremark's new prong for officers, not directors? That is still good law in the state of Delaware. It has not been tested. The case was resolved, so it was not appealed. Obviously, Caremark claim goes to directors now, but if there was ever a Caremark claim or that was crying out to be heard, it strikes me that this is one of them. The largest amount paid to settle a Caremark claim is currently $985 million by Petrobras US. So the US subsidiary of Petrobras. So for those who think this is really Dominion TD Bank Canada or Toronto Dominion Bank Canada, it's their fault. It doesn't matter that they're a Canadian bank and they're the world's 30th biggest bank. They're the 10th largest bank in America. So I think there's a huge Caremark claim here. I'm going to be very interested to see if anybody pushes the officers and directors because all of this information went to the highest levels of the company, both at the executive level and the board who approved this flat cost paradigm. And I think we are just beginning to see this case, but it's just boggles the mind, the quotes that were in the criminal informations about people at the bank asking, was this money laundering? And their bosses saying, yep, it is. So I don't know where you shake out. Maybe I'm just too cynical and something. Maybe you're the steady rock of this podcast.
Oh,
So
please. I may be the steady rock, but I'm definitely not uncynical. So I actually did want to talk about what some of those quotes because they were what drew me most in this human experience of these people because the tellers were dealing with criminal gangs and fentanyl gangs and human traffickers and they were dealing with them day in and day out, literally in front of them. There's some writing that's really interested in here, right? So employees were emailing each other about their concerns. And one manager wrote to his supervisor. He said, after the criminal gang kept coming in and out with cash, he said, "You guys really need to shut this down, LOL." Like, I'm not sure what's funny about that, but I digress. Another regional manager asked his supervisors in charge of the whole region, writing, "It is getting out of hand, and my tellers are at the point they don't feel comfortable handling these transactions," unquote. Now, that may have felt better slightly when they found out that a criminal gang had given the tellers $57,000 in bribes in gift cards. So that's always helpful. And then in one day, you were alluding to this, Tom, that the criminal gangs purchased $1 million in official bank checks in one day. And the employee asked in writing, "How is this not money laundering?" And the back office person wrote back and said, "Oh, it 100% is." So if the internal auditors, regulators, regional supervisors, day to day employees, everybody's complaining about money laundering and nobody did anything about it, it's not a whistleblower issue per se, because these are all people telling you what's happening. No response is no response.
So where do you shake out on the penalty? Do you think it's appropriate for what they did? Does there need to be something more? How do we communicate to not only TD Bank, but literally the rest of the financial world? The United States government takes this extraordinarily seriously.
I don't think you can. At this point, my cynicism is so high. It's out of my house. It's so high because it doesn't feel, I mean, no one's prepared to let anything fail, right? We've already definitely established that. So I don't know what you do with it. At least they have a monitor. Okay. Let's give them credit for that. They've got a 3-year monitorship. But I mean, I certainly hope that helps. At the same time, I don't know what the number is that stops this stuff, right? This happened over 9 years. What do you do with that? And the collateral damage for people who are affected by the fentanyl, affected by the human trafficking, affected by the modern slavery and the terrorists financing and all the rest of it. How do you account for that? I don't know, but I don't think we've been able to figure out how to do it yet.
The growth or restriction on growth is not new. We saw that with Wells Fargo. But what is new and the new wrinkle that the OCC put on was a continued ability to restrict growth. And Wells Fargo was in the $250 billion range. So I'm not sure what the growth restriction did or didn't do to Wells Fargo, but maybe that's something. I want to shout out to the OC, or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, because they didn't recite the facts like the DOJ did in the criminal information. But what they did in their settlement was they laid out their expectations for a best class AML program. And it's the most recent. So if you're in the financial industry, financial services industry, obviously banking, it's a great resource. I've linked to that in my blog post. At some point, I'm going to explore that as well. But I found that order from the OCC a wealth of information. Both the OCC and the DOJ have monitors in this case.
We've got a bunch of extraordinary cases. We had a little bit of a smaller case, but Tom, you wanted to talk about it. This is Indian bribery. What do we got?
This is an SEC enforcement action, and I guess I was talking to Mike Volkov, and he said, "Where the heck is the DOJ, FCPA enforcement?" And then in the same breath, he said, "Oh yeah, it's over at the SEC." So the SEC is cranking out cases, and Moog is one of them. So this is not a DOJ matter, but the thing that it's a relatively small penalty, I think just over 1 million. And the thing that struck me, Kristy, the bribery schemes were two. They used a distributor and then they used a third party consultant. They concocted a false transaction to get the money to pay the consultant to pay the bribe. Obviously, there's a fair amount of knowledge up in, at least in the Indian subsidiary of Moog, but these are schemes that are not new. They've been around for at least since 2010. And here we are, 2020 and 2022. Companies are using the same schemes. And did they get the memo? Did they not take the training? Have they been on Trigger Island? What is it? Why? How is this being allowed?
I mean, when I was looking at this, I honestly, I thought this is recent conduct. So many of these that we see, the issue started in 2014 or 2012 or 2015. And here, this is 2020 to 22. This is recent. I guess both of the TD and this one are recent. But goodness me, in this day and age, come up with something more creative. It's like retro. I had to do this third party consultant payment. It's like silly.
I have never heard that word used in the context of the FCPA. I'm so proud of you. Retro.
It is. It's totally retro. Get some AI in here, people. Let's get exciting about this. Famous last words. Next year, we'll get one with AI. All right.
I have to introduce this next article because I thought your selection of it was great.
Okay.
The article is fabulous, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.
All righty. So I'm taking a controversial take on this. I decided to take on Wei Chen's article called Stop Obsessing Over the ECCP. ECCP, for any of you who aren't aware, is the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs Guidance. And she has some really serious clout in this space. As she points out in this article, she was the author of the original Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Program Guidance while she was at the Department of Justice. She says that authors writing blogs and articles are missing the point. I'm assuming, Tom, you and I are both in that category of the guidance. And then she describes 3 myths, as she calls them, about the ECCP. The first of her myths is that the ECCP updates are significant shifts in how the DOJ evaluates corporate compliance programs. So her point here is that their focus hasn't changed much, just the verbiage. But I would challenge her on this by saying that there is an entirely new section on AI and risk assessment regarding the use of technology. So there definitely are places where there are a sea change. And look, she's not incorrect. There are giant places where there aren't big changes. There's one sentence on third parties that changes and it's not significant. But the fact is, there are places that we need to be paying attention because it's not that nothing changes, something did. The second myth that she explained, that compliance officers feel like they need all the right answers to the ECCP questions. So here she's focused correctly, in my mind, that no one will have the right answer to every question. No compliance program is essentially perfect. And since every investigation is different, you don't know where the focus would be if you were to have to go up against one of these prosecutors. Okay. But why wouldn't you want to be able to answer with as many yeses as possible to the DOJ's questions? So, what harm is there in trying to get to as many yeses as possible, especially when the focus is on things like obtaining new information from other departments, having access to technology and data? I don't understand why you wouldn't make it your goal to get as many as you could while acknowledging that no program is perfect, right? And the third myth, she says, is that the guidance is a leading predictive indicator in the risk landscape. And she says this is a myth because the ECCP is reactive, meaning the DOJ has changed the language based on what they're seeing in the past, but it's not predictive of the future. Okay, my response: none of us outside the DOJ know what they've been seeing, right? So why wouldn't we want to respond to what they've been seeing and paying attention to once we know it? And the way we know it is when we see that ECCP update. So I think that Way is right that we shouldn't all panic, but really, I disagree with her. I think ultimately we need to be paying attention to the changes because they help us in our programs to be better. And God forbid we get in front of them. Having as many yeses as we can is useful. So I don't know, Tom, what do you think of Way's arguments here? Where's she right? Where's she off base? What's your opinion?
So I maybe come down in the middle of you and her. I certainly think that it's an evolution, but I think it's always an evolution. We have heard discussions from the Department of Justice, certainly over the past 6 months, about AI. And I was prepared to see that in this iteration of the 2020 update. I have viewed this, I've always been intrigued by the following question. Does a change in the ECCP, does that come from the DOJ thinking up something and wanting it? Or does it come from a very progressive company, no doubt represented by Kristy Grant-Hart, going in front of the Department of Justice and said, "We took these steps, which are these 5 paces past what was required under the ECCP, and it worked for us, and here's the data." And the DOJ says, "We like that," and they incorporate that. And the example I would point you to is when we went from having training to targeted and effective training. That was because somebody came in there with data that showed we targeted these high risk employees for high risk training and we tested their effectiveness after we gave it to them, which in 2017 or whenever that came out, that was pretty out there. So I think it's an evolution, but I also think, Christy, the DOJ listens. They listen to people like us. They listen to commentators. They listen to writers, and their thinking evolves too. I did interview someone earlier this week who thought that the DOJ wanted to push back to companies and maybe harden positions a little bit, which I frankly had not thought of. But for me, Chrissy, that all of that is really immaterial because this is great information. And whether that information comes from fraud department lawyers who thought it up, whether it comes from people like you and me sitting across the table saying, "We did this. Here's what the data shows," whether it came from a commentator like Mike Volkov says, "Why don't we try this?" It doesn't matter to me because I'm just intrigued by what I see as a continuing, not a person to person dialogue, but a dialogue between outside counsel, a dialogue between corporate compliance officers, a dialogue, people like us as commentators, and with the Department of Justice as we move and evolve in our thinking of what's a best practice compliance program. And this is the DOJ's most current thinking. And then it's up to people like us to go to our clients and say, this is either best practices or minimum standards, depending on where you're sitting. But what could we do better for us, for our company? And if needed, if required, rather, could we present that with data to back it up? On the one hand, I think Wei Chin's right because I don't think we need to worry about it or obsess over it. On the other hand, I think you're right too, because it may be retrospective in terms of how we got there, but it's prospective in how we are going to use it. And then people like you and I or outside counsel or consulting firms will then build upon that and there'll be another iteration and we'll all embrace it because it makes compliance better.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's go from the whole United States to the great state of Texas, where you are, Tom. This one's pretty good. Why don't you tell us what happened?
Yeah, this is just great. We've actually talked about this in our Rotary Club in my little hometown. That's what a big deal this is. And it is the state of Texas put together out of its own funds a $5 billion fund to give low interest loans for gas fired power plants, so natural gas fired plants. Um, Environmentally friendly, something that we certainly need in the great state of Texas. We've got a lot of natural gas, so it would seem to be a pretty good thing. And so the state put out a bid and you had to go through a process, and there was going to be 3 rounds, sort of round 1 of and then a second round where there would be kind of a deep dive into your individual proposal and then the final cut. It's not clear if they're going to fund the full 5 billion or it'll be something less, but in the first round, and all of this is supposed to be audited by Deloitte. It's supposed to advise the state of Texas on which submissions meet the state's requirements. One of the companies out of Florida or a company called Agile Power, submitted an application, and they said that they were backed by a Florida company called Era Energy Resources, which is a big player in the clean energy space. And it turned out that was an outright lie, that they weren't backed. And indeed, NextEra sent a letter to the state of Texas. Then the state of Texas started looking a little closer into Agile, and it turned out that their CEO was a convicted felon, had fraudulently scammed money from other governments or governmental entities. And so the company, their application, which had been approved to go to the next level, was not approved to go through. And so the regulators, but more importantly, the legislature has directed their ire at Deloitte for letting this happen. And Deloitte's had some great responses, Kristy, one of which was we didn't look at them closely in those arenas because we wanted to get them to the next stage where that they would do the risk and reputational checks. Okay. Uh, but my personal favorite was a Deloitte partner who said, gosh, now that we know what to look for, I can evaluate them. That didn't sit very well with even the senators of the great state of Texas, and we won't comment about their intellectual abilities. But this is a huge foobar. You have a convicted felon who gets through the first round of the application process with a clearly fraudulent application. And Deloitte said, we didn't really look at that. We were evaluating other things. What were you supposed to evaluate? We could run a records check and find out somebody's a convicted felon. Can you say background due diligence, Kristy?
I can, but the response from the state senator that was quoted in the article you sent was pretty amazing. That statement that you said right now, oh, now that I know what I'm looking for, it'd be very easy to find, sir. And the response from the senator was, what do you mean what you're looking for? If they're a convicted felon, I should probably not advance them. Is that what you're looking for? Do I need to spell it out for you? Yeah, I would not want to be in that hot seat. All right. Thank you for bringing that one up, though. That is classic. Maybe somebody should take a remedial due diligence course. I'm just saying that's kind of 101 there. All right, let's go on to a piece by our friend Menke Sun at the Wall Street Journal. And in it, she interviews Facebook's whistleblower, whose name is Frances Haugen. So Ms. Haugen famously gathered documents and provided them to the Wall Street Journal around 2021, which led to congressional hearings and numerous legal actions against Facebook. And it's been 3 years and 1 memoir since the Facebook circus all erupted. And in that time, she has moved to Puerto Rico, written her book, and begun speaking publicly to governments and activists about whistleblowing and its importance. So the part of this that was most interesting was about AI and the risk it creates, as well as whistleblower payments. She said, and I'm quoting this, we have to have stronger whistleblower protections across industries because every industry is now an AI company, enclosed. She supports whistleblowing financial awards, interestingly, for the support of legal support and legal services. So she said in the article that without financial incentives, whistleblowers wouldn't be able to withstand the legal ramifications of blowing the whistle, and that the lawyers probably wouldn't have an incentive to defend the whistleblowers in the first place. She says, quote, I think most people don't understand that this is such a critical puzzle piece, unquote. Now, Tom, I think most of the places in the world don't have payment structures that are similar to things like Dodd-Frank. Do you think she's right? Do you think they need to? Do you think they should or ever will? What's your take on this?
I think we need to think through the entire holistic approach to AI, and this needs to be a part of it. But we're in many ways in uncharted territory here. It didn't surprise me that she advocated this because of her background, and that I think rewards are helpful to incentivize people. But you've lived in, I'll say Europe, but the United Kingdom.
It was Europe at
They
that
don't,
point to a certain degree. It was
well, I
pre-Brexit.
mean, they don't, yeah, they don't consider themselves part of
No,
Europe.
they don't.
But I mean, if you're going to start paying whistleblowers in at least the continent of Europe, that's going to bring up a lot of very bad memories. And
Mm.
that's still an ongoing dialogue in Europe. So I'm not quite sure if that's a viable thing to do in some countries, but it's certainly been embraced wholly by the US government.
Yeah. It's interesting that idea of seeking legal support. That hadn't been one of the considerations I put in my head about the need for whistleblower money and payouts. So there we go. Let's go to a slightly more esoteric, not heard about very often piece of our podcast. Tom, what are you looking at next?
So that's exactly why I picked this article, Christy, because I don't think compliance practitioners think about this very much at all, even those in the export control world. And it's an article that comes to us from Corruption, Crime, and Compliance, the blog, but not by Mike Volkov, by one of his associates, Alexandra Kosha. And he talked about a settlement, Quantum Corporation, over anti boycott provisions. Now, I come out of the energy industry, and this is something we were taught very early. So it's very familiar to me what anti boycott provisions are. And it basically says there are certain dynamic political dynamics in the world that you cannot allow one country to say you can't do business with another country. And the primary one is Arab Israeli. And that's where Quantum got into trouble. And you have to physically object to any such clause. And here, Quantum didn't object to the clauses. So they had multiple violations. Now, the fine was relatively small, just over 150,000. But the larger point is uh, anti boycott provisions do exist. Those of us who practiced in the Middle East know to look for those, but many people who don't practice in the Middle East may not. And I also wanted to bring it forward, Christy, because two other countries or two other sets of countries that are covered under this. One is India, Pakistan. So if you happen to have contractual relations in either of those countries and they try to prevent you from doing business with any way in the other country, that violates the boycott provisions. But more importantly, and one I think that's going to become much more to the forefront in America is Republic of China and Taiwan is also part of the anti-boycott provision. So it would not surprise me at all if China tries to bring down an economic hammer on companies by putting boycott provisions in. That's illegal under US law. And you need to be cognizant of that. It's an issue that doesn't come up very much, although Mr. Volkov informed me that this was the third anti-boycott case in 2024. But I wanted to shout out to Alexander for writing about it and teaser. I'm going to do a podcast with him on it.
Oh, I love that. Look, I think that most people aren't familiar with this. And also, as it was pointed out in the article, it's not just that you can't agree to these clauses, you have to tell the government that they're trying to get them into your contract. And it was pointed out that there were 45 instances where they just didn't tell anybody. And my guess is they didn't know because it's not very frequently understood. In my job as director of compliance for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, I handled these, right? We had these. So I was very conscious of this type of issue, but I don't think that's true, and certainly not in most of America. So, if you have any of those kind of business relationships, do check out any place that says, no, we won't let you take anything from Israel ever. And you need to call a lawyer. And that happens so you know exactly what to do. Okay. Tom, I don't know if you've heard, but there's an election going on in the United States in the next couple of weeks. Have you heard about that at all?
Sounds
A
familiar.
little bit. A little bit. Okay. That means that passions are flying high and that those types of passions are somewhere between pain and catastrophe when they enter the workplace. So, a group called Colpeo HR published an article titled Leading Through Election Season, a guide for managing politics in the workplace. So, as the article notes, mismanaged political discourse can negatively impact morale, productivity, and workplace culture. And the article talks about many suggestions for managing political problems. So, some of the major takeaways include communicating policies early. You may have already wanted to do that, but no time like the present. Setting expectation for people to act with respect. Talking about the company's values and how they relate to people's actions and interactions. And as a leader, even if you have strong political opinions yourself, demonstrating neutrality so people feel like they can trust you. And lastly, they recommend being proactive in your support of voting and civic duty. So I hadn't thought of this one. They recommend that the company promote people taking time off from work to vote, or putting up posts of information about voting locations nearby your office, and encouraging people to be poll workers. So these are all seen as neutral ways to foster positive dialogue without choosing sides. Tom, during the SECE conference, we had all the Sparkies come together for a dinner. And very early on, we're in Texas. All right, let's just start there. I told everybody we are not talking about politics. This is a dinner, but this is a work event. Please, I swear, 5 different times I had to shut down conversations as they started because they ended up with political bents. And we're not doing this. So even when you're in charge of a company and people who are really very respectful in general, it's tricky to try to manage these things.
I agree.
And that's all I have to say about that. All right. Tom, why don't you tell us about Boeing?
So the district court in Dallas, where the original Boeing criminal matter was brought, had a hearing last week on whether to approve or not the Department of Justice and Boeing's agreement for the settlement with additional criminal penalties and a new 3-year monitorship. The victims' families had objected to the settlement. So the court held a hearing on it. And yesterday, the court issued a supplemental order asking for additional briefing on this. And most people who I've talked to or commentators so far focused on a part of the court's order, which said he wanted more information on the Justice Department's requirements for DEI in the monitorship team. And they said, oh, now the courts are politicizing monitorships. I didn't read it that way at all. The court did ask for briefing from the Department of Justice because a DOJ lawyer that he wasn't really the right person to explain what that meant. The court noted that Boeing awards some discretionary bonus to executives for advancing their own DEI initiatives. Boeing has DEI initiatives within the company. And what the judge said was he wanted to make sure that they had the best monitor team to fulfill the obligations as laid out under the proposed monitorship order because the DOJ and Boeing don't want court oversight. But I read it differently, Kristy, because I think the judge is concerned that the way this is drafted, it will be a monitor around compliance, but the compliance is the safety of the aircraft. And I think the judge correctly recognizes that the monitorship language is really a very square peg. The DOJ is trying to ram through a round hole. And I think the court wants, and the court, because the court went on to require both Boeing and the Department of Justice to comment on how the monitor was going to actually do something beyond policies and procedures to fix Boeing so that this doesn't happen again. And there's a lot of things wrong with Boeing, starting with the culture, safety, whistleblowers, trust, the manufacturing process, the supply chain process. We have talked about that on this podcast, and I've talked about it, as my wife says, obsessively ad nauseum. So what I think I see the court saying is, I'm not sure this monitorship as proposed, because it's a compliance monitor overseeing Boeing for lying to the Department of Justice and then having additional safety issues, starting with the door blowing off in a Boeing jet and Alaskan Air jet. I think the court is concerned about the overall scope of the monitorship. The DEI provisions in the DOJ selection process, I think, speak to the court saying, I want the best monitor or team of monitors or monitorship team to do this job. And I want to make sure that what they're being asked to do actually resolves the problem. I'm fully in favor of having a diverse monitorship team because, as in everything, Christy, the more diversity of thought you have, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's religion, whether it's national origin, you're going to get different perspectives and a better overall product, a higher quality product. But the DOJ has said, and Boeing has agreed to, that's how this selection will be made. And I think the court is concerned that number one, the monitorship as structured may not solve the problem. And number two, the court wants to see the best monitorship team in place to try to resolve that.
It's frightening how scary the letters DEI have become, isn't it? That just immediately triggers so much response.
Let me add, not as an afterthought, because I meant to have this in my opening remarks. If I were the DOJ, I would come in and say, we fully embrace DEI. And here's why. DEI encompasses everything that Boeing needs to fix. It encompasses energy in the supply chain. It encompasses safety. It encompasses trust. It encompasses human relations. It encompasses whistleblower. It encompasses corporate governance. All of those things are within the framework of DEI. And that's why I find the term DEI and the concept of DEI so powerful, because it's the first time companies have looked at a disparate number of issues from a holistic approach. Companies have always looked at those issues separately, but they were siloed. And if I were the DOJ, I'd come in and say, we fully embrace this approach. And here's why. All of the things that we think are broken or wrong with Boeing Judge, we think using the DEI framework to look at them holistically, we can accomplish the goals of this monitorship. So I don't know if they'll do that, but they haven't listened to me yet.
So we had two of our stories take place in Texas. Shall we finish in Florida?
God's country at its finest.
Okay. Let's talk about Florida man. So this Florida man correctly identified that he had bad drugs. Okay. It's just how he verified the drugs were bad. It baffles the mind. So Florida man Timothy Guntner was unhappy because the neighbors' dark dogs were barking. And what did he do about it? He broke into their house, obviously, while they were home, and they were quite terrified, as you might imagine. One of the burglary victims managed to flag down a deputy who was patrolling in the area. And when the police arrived, Mr. Guntner stated that he'd received some bad narcotics and requested that the police officers test the drug to see what's wrong with them. It turns out the bag contained meth and that Mr. Guntner was arrested for both narcotics possession and for burglary. So that's how Mr. Gardner learned that some things are better left untested, especially by the police.
Should we limit that to Florida or can we expand that out?
I think we can expand that nationwide, perhaps worldwide, which is how we try to do things here at the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast. Thank you for joining me. I'm Kristy Grant-Hart.
And I'm Tom Fox.